Nice and smooth.
2023 marks the start of a 2-year celebration of one of the greatest British groups of all time, the Kinks. The Journey Part 1 is the first in a series of anthologies intended to chart the creative evolution of the group. In this video, brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform which enables you to create your own professional website or online store, we'll look at not only this album, but all their original albums from the first phase of their career. I'm Andrew from Parlogram, and welcome to Part 1 of the Kinks' Great British Albums. My first thought when I saw this album was, if there's one thing the world doesn't need, it's another Kinks compilation. Since 1966, there have been over 30 Kinks compilations, more than any of their British Invasion contemporaries. So what makes this one special? And is it any good? Well, unlike most Kinks compilations, The Journey follows a different path than those that have gone before, in that it isn't a collection of their greatest hits. In fact, it's quite an odd compilation. The 30 tracks on this album, or 36 if you're buying it on CD, have all been selected by the surviving group members themselves to, as it says here, reflect the trials and tribulations of their journey through life together as a band since 1963. Unlike regular compilations, the tracks on here are not presented in chronological order. Instead, the album is divided up into 4 sections, where we witness Ray Davies becoming increasingly miserable and disillusioned. It's a brave move, which is designed to appeal to both casual and die-hard fans alike. Sensibly, the album doesn't ignore their biggest and best hits, and also features some of their lesser-known album tracks, not just from the 60s, but refreshingly from the 70s too. Now, I'm not a die-hard Kinks fan, and like many of you, have had a few Kinks compilations in my time, such as this one from 1989. But hearing the random album tracks and B-sides on The Journey has inspired me to revisit and investigate their album catalogue in a little more depth. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at their first 4 albums from 1964 to 1966. But before we get into that first album, let's begin at the beginning. Like many groups in the early 1960s, the primary focus was on singles. Fans loved them because of their excitement, and record companies loved them because they were cheap to make. And it was the format which drove the industry for over 30 years. Today, singles are more of a niche product, reserved for collectors and those of us of a certain age who can remember our first or favourite single. And I know I will never fall out of love with them. Pye was one of the biggest and best-known record labels in Britain in the 1960s. They began producing televisions and radios out of their factory in Cambridge, but branched out into the record business when they bought Nixa Records in 1953, after which it acquired Polygon Records, which had been set up primarily to distribute records by Petula Clark. In 1958, they began licensing records from US labels such as Chess, Colpix and A&M, and releasing them on their Pye International label, such as this 1960 album by Chuck Berry called More Chuck Berry. Pye Nixa then became Pye Records in 1959 and was headed by a man named Louis Benjamin. Benjamin was a good businessman and lived and breathed show business, but knew little about music, pop especially. Instead, he relied on his team of producers like Tony Hatch and John Schroeder to guide him, leading to the success of artists such as Petula Clark, Sandy Shaw, Donovan, and of course the Kinks. And if you thought EMI was tight with money, Pye was even tighter, and the label gained a reputation for being sort of cheap, as one of Benjamin's main focuses was on Pye's budget label releases. But more about that later on. Unlike EMI, who were using their own in-house built equipment, Pye, despite being one of the country's leading electronics manufacturers themselves, opted to record using American equipment made by Ampex, more specifically the Ampex 300-3 3-track recorder, which Ray Prickett can be seen balancing in this shot. There's actually some great British Pathé footage of the Searchers recording in the very same studio from around that time, which you really must watch, and I'll put a link to that in the description. On January the 17th, 1964, the Kinks entered those studios to record 5 songs, 4 of which would appear on their first 2 singles. The first of those was an uninspiring cover of Little Richard's Long Tall Sally, which was released on February the 7th, 1964, but that flopped and made only number 42 on the Melody Maker chart. Matters didn't improve with their next single, You Still Want Me. In fact, they got even worse, and the single didn't make it onto any chart. Undeterred, they ploughed on and joined the treadmill of the one-nighter package tours, alongside the Dave Clark 5, as well as fellow new boys, the Hollies, but the singles still weren't selling. With their backs up against the wall and their contract with Pi in danger of being terminated, Ray Davies came up with one of the finest and most influential records of the 1960s. As Ray Davies explains in the notes which come with the Journey album, he wrote You Really Got Me about a girl he saw dancing in the audience in a club in Soho. But when he went to find her to tell her about it, she'd disappeared, and he's been looking for her ever since. The success of You Really Got Me saved not only their contract with Pi, but became their first #1 single in the UK, as well as their breakthrough hit in the States, where it reached number 7, albeit a year later. It was also a pivotal record in the development of rock music itself, inspiring contemporaries such as Pete Townsend of The Who, who took the genre to a different level in the decade which followed. Such was the demand for this single that Pi's factory couldn't keep up, and they had to contract pressing out to rivals EMI. And my copy is one of those EMI pressings. You can tell it's an EMI pressing by looking at the centre boss, which is slightly larger than those of Pi's own pressings, and identical to this Beatles single, which was pressed at around the same time. However, looking at the matrices, EMI seem to have used Pi's metalwork to press it rather than cutting a stamper of their own. Now, this was a track I was really keen to hear on this new album, and you know me, I wanted to compare its sound quality against this original 45. The version on the LP, and indeed all of the other tracks on it, were cut and mastered by one of the best in the business, Kevin Gray at Coherent Audio, who's been cutting Kinks discs in both mono and stereo for a number of years. Now, I'm not sure at which plant the EU pressing was pressed, but the discs are clean and flat and weigh very close to 180 grams, and thankfully come inside poly-lined inner sleeves. Of course, I had to take a look at the waveforms, and when I did, I noticed something unusual on the new version. Let me show you what I mean. Here's the waveform of the opening riff of You Really Got Me, recorded from the original 45, the 1989 Castle album, and from the new Journey album. And the unusual thing I noticed was this line all the way through the Journey recording at around 15 kHz. It's present on the other tracks too. This is the waveform of the beginning of Waterloo Sunset, which proves that the noise is not from my turntable or interference from something in my room, because the line appears after the stylus hits the disc. Well, the audio disappears just over the 12K mark for me, so whatever it is, I can't hear it. But the VU meters show me there's something there. So if you know what it is and why it's there, do let me know in the comments. If you have a skill or a hobby you want to turn into a business and want to create a stylish professional website, online store, portfolio or blog, Squarespace can help you turn your ideas into reality. But an online store needn't just be for physical goods. Squarespace's e-commerce builder makes it easier to sell subscriptions to products, as well as digital content like music and ebooks via direct download from your site. It's perfect for selling via social media like Facebook and Instagram, where you can sell and advertise directly from your posts, stories, and shops on your profile or page. And if you're looking to raise money for your project or cause by crowdfunding, you can do so by creating multiple bio sites for yourself, your brand, and your business. Check out squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/parlogram to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So with You Really Got Me shooting up the charts, Pi naturally wanted an album out as soon as possible. The sessions for the album took place over a couple of weeks in August, again in Pi No. 2 studio, with Shel Talmy in the producer's chair, flanked by Pi's recording engineers Bob Alger and the masterful Ray Prickett. Not for the first time, session musicians such as Bobby Graham on drums, Jimmy Page on guitar, John Lord on the organ, and Nicky Hopkins on the piano were all employed throughout the recordings. Also, being an independent producer and not an in-house Pi guy, Shel Talmy was charged for the session. It was only when the group became more successful and therefore more profitable that Pi coughed up for the sessions themselves. The Kinks' debut album, simply titled Kinks, was released on October the 2nd in the UK, in mono only, and went top 5 in all of the UK Pop Papers album charts. Although it's a thrill to find mint-condition records from this period, in truth, I always find them a bit sad and unloved, as opposed to this copy, which has clearly been loved and enjoyed by someone called Helen. Kinks is a very solid album, with a real energy about it, and unlike most pop albums from this period, isn't made up of rejected singles. Instead, it's a heady mixture of R&B classics interspersed with some fine early Ray Davies compositions, most notably Just Can't Go to Sleep and Stop Your Sobbin', both of which are included on the Journey album. Although it was released in mono only in the UK, a proper stereo mix was done and pressed by Pi, but that was for export only, mainly to Scandinavia. The only track which wasn't in true stereo on that pressing was You Really Got Me. Unlike Capitol's duophonic disasters of that period, this track was subtly enhanced by adding just a touch of reverb, which sounds like this. Talking of the Beatles, it wasn't just their albums that were being butchered in the US. The Kinks' US label Reprise chopped out 3 tracks from this album: I Took My Baby Home, I'm a Lover Not a Fighter, and Revenge. Pi reissued this album in January 1966 on their Golden Guinea label. Launched in 1959 and the brainchild of Pi's chairman Louis Benjamin, Golden Guinea was Pi's budget label, specialising in classical music and traditional jazz. And as the label suggested, each album retailed for 1 guinea, which was 11 shillings less than the price of a regular full-price album. It was similar to EMI's Music for Pleasure, which was much less coy about its price. Now, I always get a lot of comments when I mention Old English money in these videos, so here's a quick guide as to how things operated back then. Up until 1971, when Britain adopted the decimal system they have today, British currency was made up from pounds, shillings, and pence. 12 pence, or pennies, made up a shilling, and 20 shillings, or 240 pence, made up £1. A guinea was £1 and 1 shilling. A guinea was considered more gentlemanly than a pound. You paid tradesmen, such as a carpenter, in pounds, but gentlemen, for example lawyers and doctors, in guineas. The Golden Guinea edition of this album was housed in a cover which followed the original design, but there was no overlooking its budget credentials. The record had the same yellow design as the rest of the series. And rather than going to the extra expense of recutting the album, Pi just reused the original metalwork, crossing out its Pi matrices and replacing them with Golden Guinea ones. Released on May 5th, 1965, their second album, Kinda Kinks, was definitely a step up from the previous album. This time, 10 of its 12 tracks were written by Ray Davies and included the recent #1 single Tired of Waiting for You. And this, along with So Long and Nothing in This World Can Stop Me Worrying About My Girl, are included on the Journey album. And in the booklet which comes with that album, it says that the song was written about waiting for a bus. Forced to record the album just 2 weeks after returning from an exhausting Asian tour, neither Ray or the group were happy with the finished article. But Pi didn't care about that, nor did they even take the time to make a stereo mix, let alone correct any flawed mixes. Kinda Kinks was the sound of a group finding their feet, and is seen by some as their true debut album. It doesn't, unlike the first album, lean so heavily on the R&B, blues and rock and roll influences. Instead, it looks forward to the more contemporary soul and folk sounds, and you can really hear Ray's songwriting beginning to develop its own character. The album wasn't released in the US until August 1965, and then with a rearranged track listing and repackaged cover. Reprise removed several tracks and added the Set Me Free single, which came out after the UK edition. Their third album, Kink Controversy, was released in November 1965. The album's title was a reference to the controversy they'd caused on their US tour that summer. Despite being one of the most popular British invasion groups, the tour was dogged by fights with management, local promoters, and not to mention between themselves. In the end, the American Musicians Union had had enough and took the drastic decision to withhold their work permits for the next 4 years, which effectively banned the group from performing in the US until 1969. The album was once again recorded at Pi's No. 2 studio in London between October the 25th and 30th, except for Milk Cow Blues, which had been recorded a few months earlier. It's an album which sees the group at a musical crossroads. Although still attached to their blues R&B heritage with tracks like Milk Cow Blues, the album was a turning point, not just for the group, but for Ray Davies' songwriting, which was becoming more confident and mature. But it's a kind of dark, uneven-sounding album, and does little to hide the downbeat mood, which is not surprising given the experience of that ill-fated US tour. And just like the Beatles on Beatles for Sale, you could almost hear the world weariness setting in. The power chord-driven single Till the End of the Day is included, but unlike the singles on their previous albums, it didn't make number 1. It's a popular album for finding deep cuts, but not one of their most commercial. The Journey album carries just 2 tracks from it, the B-side to Till the End of the Day, Where Have All the Good Times Gone, and It's Too Late, featuring Nicky Hopkins on piano. Unusually, the album was released in the US a week before the UK, and with different artwork too. However, it barely scraped into the top 100 on both the Billboard and Cashbox album charts. 1966 was an incredible year for pop music, and it was the year that the Kinks really found their groove. The first single that year, the mocking, dedicated follower of fashion, was a perfectly timed piece of pop satire and was a massive hit all around the world. However, the pressure was beginning to tell on Ray Davies, and he suffered a nervous breakdown at around the time the follow-up single, Sunny Afternoon, hit the number 1 spot.
'Cause he gets up in the morning, then he goes to work at 9.
But with Ray out of action, Pi were desperate to build upon the success of both those singles, so they released the Kinks' first compilation album, called Well Respected Kinks. Issued on their budget Marble Arch label in September 1966, the album contained just 5 tracks per side, and as all of them had been released previously either on singles or EPs, there was very little for fans to get excited about. But so hot were the group at that point, the album turned out to be a huge seller and spent 35 weeks on the charts, the most that any Kinks album had spent on the charts up to that point. The album may have also been many people's introduction to the group, and sat alongside the Beatles' collection of oldies and The Best of the Beach Boys as one of the most popular compilation albums of the year.
Hello, who's that speaking, please?
By October, Ray Davies had recovered, and the Kinks spent that month recording their 4th studio album, Face to Face, which hit the shops on October the 18th, 1966. Face to Face was unquestionably their strongest and best album so far. And although only 22, Ray Davies's songwriting on this album is way beyond his years, and was the first Kinks album to be made up of entirely original songs. It's an album which truly has a personality of its own, and is full of sharp and witty observations. Some even went as far as to call it a concept album. But again, like their previous album, critical acclaim didn't translate into sales, and despite the inclusion of the Sunny Afternoon single, it failed to make the top 10 in the UK. And maybe, like one of its contemporaries, Revolver, it was perhaps a little too far ahead of its audience. And despite everything British being in at that time in the US, the album didn't even make the top 100 there. Surely things would have been different if their US Musicians Union ban hadn't prevented them from promoting it in person. And maybe Ray Davies doesn't rate it very highly either today, as the only track from it on the journey is Too Much on My Mind, a song recorded while their bass player was recovering from a car crash. Unlike their previous two studio albums, Face to Face did receive a stereo mix, but like most albums from this period, I prefer it in mono. The Kinks had now entered their golden age, and over the period from 1967 to 1969, they produced their most memorable albums, which we'll be looking at in another video. In the meantime, The Journey Part 1 is available right now at all good record stores, with Volume 2 due out later this year. We're planning to look at other 60s British groups and artists in future videos, so if you have any suggestions on which ones you'd like to see us cover, do drop me a line in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you'll subscribe and come back for more next week. But it's all over for this one, so I'll say bye for now and thanks for watching.